Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we proceed with today's matters, I want to share something that hasn't happened in my 32 years on this bench. Something that forced me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about justice, mercy, and the weight of a man's lifetime of choices. This morning, before court convened, I received a phone call from Father Thomas Brennan at St. Mary's Cathedral. He asked if I would be willing to hear a confession, not in the religious sense, but in the human sense. An elderly man, he explained, had spent 63 years building an empire of darkness. That same man was now asking for something he had never offered anyone else: a second chance. Father Brennan didn't ask me to grant mercy. He only asked that I listen. I have listened. For the past 3 hours, I have listened to testimony that reconstructed an entire lifetime of harm, and now I must decide whether the remainder of one man's life is enough to balance the scales of justice he spent decades tipping in his favor. The defendant before me is Victor Antonelli. He was born on February 3, 1941, in a tenement apartment on Federal Hill in Providence. His father, Giuseppe Antonelli, worked at the Providence and Worcester Railroad Yard until an accident claimed his life when Victor was 11. His mother, Maria, did whatever she could to keep her 3 children fed, and what she could do was not always legal, not always safe, but always desperate. The prosecution has painted Victor as a mastermind, a man who built a criminal enterprise that spanned 4 decades, generated an estimated $47 million through extortion, illegal gambling, and sophisticated money laundering operations, and left a trail of ruined lives stretching from Rhode Island to New York to Florida. That portrait is accurate. What the prosecution cannot convey, what no document or testimony can capture, is the man himself as he sits before me today. Victor Antonelli is 81 years old. He uses a walker to move between the holding cell and the defense table. His hands tremble when he grips the armrests of his wheelchair. He breathes with difficulty, the result of congestive heart failure and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease that his attorney says will likely claim his life within the next 2 to 3 years. His eyes, though clouded by cataracts, still carry some quality I cannot quite name that makes it impossible to look away. This is not the Victor Antonelli of the surveillance footage from 1987, when he was 46 and commanding an empire. This is not the Victor Antonelli who appeared on the FBI's 10 most wanted list in 1994, who evaded capture for 11 years while continuing to direct operations from safe houses in 3 states. This is the remnant, the final chapter, the man left after everything else has been stripped away. And yet, Assistant District Attorney Harold Winfield, who has spent 14 months building this case, has presented evidence that Victor Antonelli's organization was responsible for the destruction of at least 17 small businesses in Providence and surrounding communities. These were not rival crime organizations or sophisticated criminals who could absorb losses. They were family-owned restaurants, neighborhood grocery stores, a hardware shop on Chalkstone Avenue that had been in the same family for 3 generations. Victor's organization made them pay protection money. When they couldn't pay, the organizations burned them down. When the owners tried to go to the police, they received warnings, sometimes subtle, sometimes explicit, that their families would suffer. The prosecution has introduced testimony from a woman named Evelyn Marchetti, now 67, who watched her father's restaurant, Marchetti's Trattoria, burn to the ground in 1978 when she was 19 years old. Her father, Marco Marchetti, had refused to pay protection money for the 3rd consecutive month. He wanted to save for his daughter's wedding. The fire destroyed everything. 3 months later, Marco Marchetti suffered a massive heart attack and died. Evelyn testified that her father never recovered from watching his life's work destroyed, never stopped blaming himself for being unable to protect his family. She is here today. I can see her in the 3rd row, gripping the hand of a woman who must be her daughter. She has spent 44 years waiting for this moment. She has spent 44 years wondering whether anyone in power would ever hold Victor Antonelli accountable. On the other end of this courtroom, supported by his attorney and a hospice care nurse who has been granted access to observe, Victor Antonelli waits for me to decide whether his remaining years will be spent in prison or in the freedom he has already stolen from so many others. Let me explain what Victor Antonelli's organization did and how it functioned, because understanding the scope of his crimes is essential to understanding the moral weight of my decision. Beginning in 1965, when Victor was 24 years old, he began taking over illegal gambling operations in Providence. He started small, card games in back rooms, dice games in basements, but he possessed something his predecessors lacked: organizational intelligence. He established hierarchies. He created separation between the street-level collectors and the financial operations. He laundered money through legitimate businesses, primarily restaurants and dry cleaners, creating a system so sophisticated that it took federal investigators nearly 20 years to unravel the full scope of his operations. By 1985, Victor Antonelli's organization controlled illegal gambling operations across Rhode Island, eastern Connecticut, and southeastern Massachusetts. They generated an estimated $1.2 million annually in pure profit, money that required elaborate laundering schemes to become usable. Victor established relationships with corrupt bank officials, casino executives, and business owners willing to help transform blood money into legitimate income. The human cost of this empire is incalculable. The prosecution has documented at least 6 murders connected to Antonelli's organization between 1972 and 1990. 2 of the victims were rival criminals who challenged Antonelli's territory. 4 were civilians who knew too much or saw too much, innocent people who became obstacles to be eliminated. Anthony Benedetti, a 23-year-old bookkeeper who discovered money laundering irregularities at a bank Victor used, was found floating in the Providence River in 1983. Robert Solomon, a restaurant owner who cooperated with federal investigators, died in what was officially listed as a robbery gone wrong, though no money was ever taken. Victor Antonelli was never charged with any of these murders. The witnesses who could have connected him to these crimes died, disappeared, or refused to testify. For decades, he operated with near-perfect impunity, protected by fear, corruption, and the elaborate structures of silence his organization had constructed. But time erodes everything. The walls Victor built began to crack in 1994 when his underboss, a man named Carmine DeLuca, who had been with him for 20 years, decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for immunity for his wife and children. DeLuca's testimony provided the first comprehensive view of Antonelli's operations, but Victor had already fled. He lived as a fugitive for 11 years, moving between safe houses, always one step ahead of the investigators who pursued him. He was finally captured in 2005 in a small apartment in Boca Raton, Florida. He had aged considerably. His hair had turned white. His health was already failing. But according to the agents who arrested him, his eyes still carried the cold intelligence that had allowed him to evade justice for so long. Now, 17 years later, he sits before me. The cold intelligence is still there, but it is buried beneath layers of frailty and illness. He requires assistance with nearly every physical function. He takes 17 different medications daily. His physicians have testified that he will not survive more than 3 years without constant medical care, and that even with that care, his survival probability is less than 30%. His attorney, Diana Castellanos, from the Public Defender's Office, has presented a compelling argument for mercy. She has emphasized Victor's age, his health, the likelihood that he will die before completing any significant sentence. She has argued that the goals of incarceration, punishment, deterrence, rehabilitation, and protection of the public cannot be meaningfully served by imprisoning a man with less than 3 years to live. She has suggested that home confinement, with appropriate monitoring and restrictions, would satisfy the requirements of justice while acknowledging the reality of Victor's physical condition. I have considered this argument carefully because I believe every defendant deserves a serious consideration of their circumstances regardless of their crimes. I have studied the precedents for compassionate release in cases of terminal illness. I have reviewed the medical reports, the psychological evaluations, the testimony from physicians who have examined Victor Antonelli and provided detailed assessments of his condition. All of this has informed my thinking because I believe that even in cases of overwhelming guilt, the circumstances of the defendant matter. I have read the mitigation reports prepared by his defense team, which document his childhood of deprivation, his early experiences with violence and loss, the circumstances that shaped the man he became. None of this excuses what he did, but understanding how a person becomes capable of such harm is essential to understanding how to prevent it, how to protect future generations from producing men like Victor Antonelli. But I must also consider the other arguments presented in this courtroom over the past 2 days. I must consider the weight of evidence, the scope of harm, and the accumulated suffering of those whose lives were shaped by Victor Antonelli's choices. I must consider the families who have waited decades for this moment, the communities that lived in fear, the businesses that were destroyed, the lives that were lost. All of this weighs on my decision, and it must take precedence over compassion for the man who caused it. Evelyn Marchetti testified that when she heard Victor Antonelli had finally been captured, she wept. Not from joy, she said, but from relief that someone had finally been held accountable. Her father had carried the weight of Marchetti's trattoria's destruction for the remaining 6 years of his life. He had worked 2 jobs to rebuild what he had lost, but something in him never recovered. He died believing that the people who destroyed his life's work had won, that there was no justice in the world for people like him. Evelyn Marchetti is 67 years old. She has spent 44 years watching the man who destroyed her father's dream live freely. She has watched him evade capture, live as a fugitive, and finally face trial at an age when most people are thinking about retirement, not prison. And she has sat in this courtroom for 2 days listening to arguments about whether her father's suffering and the suffering of others like him should be weighed against the remaining years of the man who caused it. Let me read you a portion of the victim impact statement submitted by Patricia Solomon, the widow of Robert Solomon, the restaurant owner who was murdered in 1986 after cooperating with investigators. She wrote, "My husband was 53 years old when he died. Our daughter was 21. Our son was 19. He was planning to walk our daughter down the aisle at her wedding in September of that year. Instead, I walked alone. Our children walked behind an empty chair. Every anniversary of his death, every graduation, every wedding, every birth in our family has been marked by his absence. For 36 years, I have wondered whether anyone would ever be held responsible. Now I am wondering whether that responsibility will mean anything at all." Patricia Solomon is 74 years old. She is here today. She has spent 36 years waiting for this moment. Victor Antonelli's organization destroyed lives, and not just the lives it ended. It destroyed the lives of people who survived, who spent decades carrying the weight of what they lost, who never knew whether the people responsible would ever face justice. The psychological damage, the economic devastation, the shattered trust in community and institutions, all of this is part of Victor Antonelli's legacy. And yet, I have spent 32 years in this courtroom. I have sentenced murderers, drug dealers, fraudsters, and men who committed acts of violence so brutal they defy description. I have tried to balance the requirements of justice against the circumstances of defendants, to find sentences that punish without being cruel, that acknowledge humanity without excusing harm. Victor Antonelli is unlike any defendant I have faced. His crimes are massive in scope, sophisticated in execution, and devastating. He built an in their consequences organization that operated for decades, that corrupted officials, that destroyed businesses, that murdered innocents. He evaded justice for most of his life, living as a free man while his victims suffered. But the man before me now is not the man who built that empire. That man was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly without mercy. This man is fragile, dependent, and asking for something he never gave. The contrast is almost unbearable. I have thought about this case constantly since it was assigned to me. I have lost sleep over it. I have discussed it with my wife, with my colleagues, with my priest. I have prayed for guidance, and I believe I have received an answer. Not the answer I wanted, not the answer that would make this courtroom easy to navigate, but the answer that my conscience demands I speak. Victor Antonelli will be sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, to be served in the medical facility at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. He will be eligible for compassionate release after serving 5 years, pending review of his medical condition by the Bureau of Prisons. His assets, which have been frozen since his arrest, will be liquidated and distributed to a victims' compensation fund established by the federal government for the benefit of those harmed by his organization. The fine imposed will be $2.3 million, representing the estimated proceeds of his criminal enterprise that have not yet been recovered. This amount will also be directed to the victims' fund. Additionally, Victor Antonelli is ordered to participate in a documentary project to be arranged by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, in which he will provide a complete accounting of his organization's operations, its victims, and its methods. This record will be preserved for historical and educational purposes, ensuring that what Victor Antonelli did is never forgotten, never minimized, never allowed to fade into the past, as though it were somehow less than what it was. I am aware that Victor Antonelli may not survive to complete this sentence. His physicians have testified that his life expectancy is measured in months, not years. I am aware that this sentence may effectively be a death sentence, that he will likely die in prison, surrounded by guards and institutional walls, rather than family and comfort. I want to explain why this outcome is necessary. For 57 years, from 1965 until his arrest in 2005, Victor Antonelli operated with near-perfect impunity. He built an empire on fear and violence. He destroyed lives without hesitation or remorse. He corrupted systems designed to protect the innocent. He evaded justice for 11 years as a fugitive, living comfortably, while his victims wondered whether anyone would ever hold him accountable. To sentence him to anything less than significant prison time would be to tell Evelyn Marchetti that her father's suffering, her 44 years of waiting, meant nothing. It would be to tell Patricia Solomon that her husband's murder, her 36 years of grief, could be canceled out by the remaining years of a dying man. It would be to tell every victim of Victor Antonelli's organization that their pain, their loss, their shattered trust in justice was not worth the consequences that should follow. That is not justice. That is not mercy. That is simply the continuation of the injustice that has defined these victims' lives for decades. But neither am I willing to pretend that the full weight of Victor Antonelli's crimes can be balanced by the remaining years of his life. He has been sentenced to 15 years, but he will likely serve less than 5. The scales of justice cannot be balanced by a dying man. That is simply not how justice works. The harm Victor Antonelli caused was massive, and no punishment can undo it. What this sentence can do is establish a principle, that the remaining years of a criminal's life do not erase the decades of suffering they caused, that victims deserve to see accountability, even if that accountability comes late, that the frailty of age and the approach of death do not immunize anyone from the consequences of their actions. Victor Antonelli will die in prison. He will spend his final years contemplating the full scope of what he did, not because I am cruel, but because that contemplation is essential to whatever redemption might be possible for him. Mercy is not the same as forgetting. Justice is not the same as revenge. Both require acknowledgement of harm. Both require acceptance of consequences. Both require the recognition that what was done cannot be undone. I want to speak directly to the victims in this courtroom. I know that many of you wanted to see Victor Antonelli spend the rest of his life behind bars. I understand that impulse. I share it. What he did to you, to your families, to your communities, was unforgivable. No sentence can change that. No words from me can restore what was taken from you. But I want you to know that I have heard you. I have heard Evelyn Marchetti, who watched her father's dream burn and spent 44 years waiting for justice. I have heard Patricia Solomon, who raised her children alone after her husband was murdered for doing the right thing. I have heard every person in this courtroom who has carried the weight of Victor Antonelli's crimes for years, even decades. Your suffering mattered to me in this decision. Your waiting mattered. Your hope that someone would finally be held accountable mattered. I cannot give you back what was taken from you, but I can tell you that this sentence, whatever its inadequacies, was given with your pain in mind. Victor Antonelli, you will now be remanded to the custody of the United States Marshal Service for transport to the federal medical facility where you will serve your sentence. You have the right to appeal this sentence within 14 days. Your attorney will explain the appeals process to you. Before you were taken, I want to say something to you directly. 81 years ago, you were born to a grieving mother and 3 children who needed a father who would never come home from work. You grew up in poverty. You watched your mother struggle. You learned at a young age that the world does not reward the weak, that survival requires strength, that power protects while powerlessness destroys. You built an empire on those lessons. You became powerful in ways most people cannot imagine. You made men fear you, women serve you, officials bow to you. You accumulated wealth, influence, and respect in the only circles that mattered to you. But you also destroyed lives. You burned down businesses that families had built over generations. You ended the lives of people who had done nothing to you except exist at the wrong place at the wrong time. You made widows and orphans. You made survivors carry weight that should have been shared. You made an entire community live in fear of what might happen if they spoke the truth. You are dying now. Your body is failing. Your time is measured in months, possibly years, but not decades. And you have asked me for mercy. I am giving you a sentence that will likely end your life. I am taking the years you have left and placing them behind walls. I am denying you the comfort of dying among family, the peace of ending your days in familiar surroundings, the dignity of passing from this world in the manner you might have chosen. Is this mercy? No, this is justice. Justice is not mercy. Justice is the recognition that what you did cannot be erased, cannot be forgotten, cannot be balanced by your remaining breath. But here is what I believe, Victor Antonelli, and I want you to hear this. I believe in redemption. I believe that every human being, no matter what they have done, has the capacity to change, to acknowledge harm, to seek some form of forgiveness. I do not know if you are capable of that change. I do not know if the man before me is the same man who gave the orders that burned Marchetti's trattoria, that ended Robert Solomon's life, that made Evelyn Marchetti spend 44 years wondering whether anyone in power would ever care. But I am giving you the chance to find out. In the years you have left, you will have the opportunity to confront what you did, to document it, to ensure that future generations understand the full scope of your crimes. That is not punishment, Victor Antonelli. That is the beginning of whatever redemption might be possible for you. The choice remains yours. You can spend your remaining years in bitterness, blaming the system, denying your responsibility, dying as the man who built an empire of destruction. Or you can use this time to acknowledge what you did, to document your crimes, to contribute to the understanding of how men like you rise and fall, how organizations like yours take root, how communities suffer when justice is delayed. I do not know which path you will choose, but I know that the choice is yours, and that whatever you choose, the record will remain, the victims will remain, the truth will remain. This court is adjourned.